Do you have the option? Oh, here we go.
Oh, we're
All
live.
right. We are live. Welcome to the weekly solar and storage news roundup. I'm Tim Montague. We are starting a new monthly roundup of solar and battery news with my friend and co host, Joe Marhamati of Sunvoy. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's been great getting to know you a little bit. Check out Joe's interview on the Clean Power Hour at cleanpowerhour.com if you want to learn about Sunvoy, if you don't know about Sunvoy. And I do want Joe to tell us a little bit about that. But we're going to be geeking out on the latest news so that you, as solar installers and energy professionals, can be up to date on what are the important trends, technologies, and must knows. You know, the only constant, Joe, in really any venture is change. And that's especially true in solar and storage. And it's especially true in 2025 because we have a change of administration, right? So we're going to be talking about some stories relevant to what's going to happen with tax credits or what's going to possibly happen with tax credits like the ITC. I found an interesting building integrated photovoltaic technology from Jackery we're going to talk about. But Joe, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and Sunboy.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Well, let's see. I've been in the industry for the better part of 2 decades. I started at the Department of Energy in the vaunted loan programs office, where I had a lot of fun during the Recovery Act, investing in some of the cool technologies that we get to work with today. 2016, my business partner, Hervé Billiot, and I started Ipsen Solar, which was a regional installer in the Washington, D.C. area, where we were doing all behind the meter rooftop solar, primarily residential, some commercial energy storage. And we sold that business in April of 2024 and moved full time into Sunvoy. Sunvoy is a white label customer portal and fleet management system. And it's really the first and only customer portal in the solar industry that's 100% white labeled. So the idea is it's the brand and name and aesthetic of the solar installer. So it looks like it was built by the solar installer for their customers. And we integrate with everything in the solar industry, including the only native Tesla integration, every CRM, every proposal tool. We bring together all the data in the industry into one central location. So that's what we're working on today.
Very cool. And of course, I'm the host of the Clean Power Hour, president of the Clean Power Consulting Group. So, Joe, we are on the doorstep of a new administration in Washington, D.C. And, you know, we've already survived Trump won in 2016 to 2020. But what are your high level thoughts about how the solar industry is changing, both because of the new administration, but also just because of what's going on in the world?
Well, it's funny. I remember when Trump came in the first time, there was sort of this explosion of solar, and some of it was because people wanted to go solar in spite of the Trump administration. And so a lot of people, I think, were motivated because they thought that there would be a backlash, and they wanted to sort of vote with their panels, in a sense, by showing that they cared about this issue, that they cared about being net zero, they cared about promoting renewable energy. I'm hopeful that something like that will happen this time around too, because it was very unexpected. And for our solar business, it was an absolute boon. And as you mentioned, there were some good things that happened during that administration for the ITC. I'm very cautiously optimistic that the same thing is going to happen this time around because there's an even bigger constituency for solar across the country in both red states and blue states. So it's that much harder to break up. We now have more domestic manufacturing, a lot of which is in red states. And so that's obviously something that is helpful for our industry, that the constituency for solar is so big and so broad that it's really hard to take a big swipe that would eliminate thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of jobs. So I also think there's going to be an interest rate cut or two in 2025, as we just saw, which obviously will help our industry. And I think that a similar cultural trend is going to happen where there's just a lot of people at the local, regional, and state level that promote solar that will want to grow our industry in spite of the federal government. So I remain cautiously optimistic, and I think we're going to have a good year.
I'm with you. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think it's very hard for Trump to kill the IRA. He will make some modifications, I don't doubt. The one consistent theme I do hear is that large wind or offshore wind is going to be in the bullseye for them to push back on. So I'm happy that I don't work in the offshore wind industry. Of course, that's a very important resource for the energy transition, and eventually offshore wind will happen. But you do see some offshore wind projects hitting the brakes um, because of the incoming administration. And then in general, though, there's this bigger thing happening in the solar and storage industry, and that is that net metering is stepping down and storage is becoming more important. This is not just in California with NEM 3.0, which was a wrecking ball for the residential solar industry, but it has made attachment rates go up, and attachment rates for storage are high now in residential, commercial, and utility solar in California. They're very high. So I like to tell my customers, if you want a crystal ball to the future, go to California or go to Northern Europe. Because, and that's one of the cool things, Joe, about our industry is we have this crystal ball because here in the Midwest, we're 10 years behind in some ways. Not in all ways, but in some ways, we're 10 years behind places like New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts and California and Hawaii. Um, so it's we are going to have the energy transition no matter who's in Washington, no matter who's the president, right? It's just a question of, is that growth rate going to be a 45-degree angle or a 30-degree angle? And it may step down a little bit. You mentioned manufacturing, for example, and one of my news stories is the Energy Show. So I like to bring up Barry Cinnamon's podcast called The Energy Show. This week, he interviews Roan Resch, who is the president and CRO of SolarLytics. Check them out. They're a performance analytics company for utility solar. But Roan was the CEO of SEIA, the Solar Energy Industries Association, from 2004 to 2016. And he was really driving the invention of and the advancement of the ITC. And so the dude is super knowledgeable about how things work in Washington. And elements of the ITC may be stepped back. You know, it's funny, Joe, because back in 2017, 18, I was telling some of my CNI customers, you know, these incentives that we have today are probably sweeter than they're ever going to be. But lo and behold, here in 2024 or 2025, depending on what happens in 2025, the incentives in 2024 with the 30% ITC, the adders for domestic content, for energy communities, and for low income, right? You could get 60% ITC. And and with those incentives, it's just mind-boggling how short the payback period has gotten on solar projects. Um, what are your thoughts, though, I guess, about the ITC specifically? Are we going to hold on to a 60% ITC?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of some of these rural projects getting up to 100% ITC when you look at the adders and I think it's the LEAP projects um, or the REAP projects. I apologize.
REAP, sure.
The REAP grants can get you up to close to 100% with the ITC.
Yeah, REAP will cover up to 50% of a solar project. So, yes, that's true. You could get a REAP grant and then an ITC. So, I mean, it's still not going to get you to 100% because the REAP actually gets deducted from the cost of the system or the tax deductible cost of the system. So then but anyway, we can go above 60 for sure.
So, some of that can be seen as perverse incentives, and we can debate whether that's true or not. So some of that might get pared back, but the core 30% ITC, I think, is safe, especially when you look at how divided the House of Representatives is. It only takes a couple of people who think it's a bad idea to break up that ITC and all the investments that have gone into utility scale solar, into manufacturing, into behind the meter solar. And there's a lot of dollars that have gone into it. into this industry with the expectation that that ITC will remain. So it's very hard for me to believe that they're going to really go hard after that in particular, given how divided the House is.
Yeah, I agree. In the Energy Show interview with Ron Rash, Roan predicts that he thinks Trump might attack, for example, the adder for energy communities. He doesn't see them attacking the adder for domestic content. In fact, he and others think that they may make domestic content a requirement to take the ITC. And I hope they don't do that, because I don't think they realize that we just don't have enough equipment that's made in the US yet. We
Mhm.
have vastly expanded the amount of solar panels being made in the US, and that's great. Because of the IRA, we're now glomming onto something like 45 gigawatts of solar panel production in the near future in the US. And that's up from, I think, 7 gigawatts pre IRA. So, we've quadrupled that, and that's great. We want more domestic solar panels, but on the inverter side, there are very few companies. SolarEdge is one, Solectria is another. In the resi space, there is a micro inverter manufacturer that's very well known, that's slipping my mind. Who is that? They're also doing some domestic content, I
Uh,
think.
Well, there's Enphase, Hoy Miles,
Yeah,
and AP
Enphase.
Systems. Yeah.
Um, yeah, what are your thoughts about domestic content specifically, I guess? And there are two ways I see my installer customers approaching this:
Hmm.
with racking and inverters,
Mm-hmm.
okay, or solar modules. And there's now a handful of companies, right, that have either propped up domestic manufacture, or are propping up domestic manufacture. And the challenge there is the cell, right? Because to get the full 40% of the cost of the materials, you probably have to have the cell be domestically manufactured, and that's a very weak link. There's only, I think, two or three companies that are making cells, um, and then you see things like REC pulling out. They were going to be making ingots and wafers in the US, and now they're not going to be. So, but what are your thoughts about domestic content and how installers can navigate this, because this is treacherous water?
It really is. I was an installer for at least a couple of years while domestic content was being sorted out, and it still feels like a confusing area for most folks to understand what actually is going to qualify or what might qualify, especially when you're talking to customers and they're looking for certainty because this could be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars for them depending on the project. That said, I don't think it's going anywhere because so much of the core of Trump's goals are around more domestic manufacturing, which is part of the reason that that was a priority in the Biden administration. That has been kind of a goal domestically for both Democrats and Republicans over the last 10 years to bring more manufacturing back to the United States. And so, even though it is incredibly confusing for installers and for customers, and a lot of it is still being hashed out, and the cell issue is not going away, that's not going to get any easier. I do think that it will, over time, result in more manufacturing coming back to the United States. And we've already seen that in the last 4 years. There was more progress in developing module manufacturing in the last 4 years than I ever could have anticipated. And it really changed my mind on this issue. If you had asked me 10 years ago, I was more of the mind of let's buy the cheapest stuff we can wherever we can get it to get to 100% solar as fast as we can. And then we saw, some of the human rights abuses from countries that were manufacturing most of the solar, and a lot of poor practices across the board. And that really changed my mind. And seeing how much of this we can do ourselves, how quickly we can bend that cost curve down to do it as cost effectively as other countries, and the importance of bringing more of those manufacturing jobs back to the United States, I think it's here to stay.
Yeah, and if you want to see a great map of solar manufacturing, and this is across the board, they have this broken out by technology, but go to solarpowerworldonline.com, and and then when you click on products, you'll see solar panels, racking, and then within solar panels, you see U.S. solar panel manufacturers, and that list is going to blow your mind. It's quite long now. We've got companies, some well known, like Helian, um, a lesser known brand, Honan, that's a Chinese company, has already propped up panel manufacturer in South Carolina. I visited that factory, and they're in the planning phase of a second factory that's going to make solar cells. So they are pursuing cell manufacture. Then you've got Imperial Star Solar, um, which has a deal with a cell manufacturer in the U.S. You've got Q Cells, you've got Mission Solar, et cetera, et cetera. So that list is long and getting longer, and it's pretty cool. Now it's not without a lot of turmoil, right? You saw Trina Solar sell their brand new 5 gigawatt plant to Freyr Battery, the Norwegian battery company, in the fall of 2024. And the reason for that is Trina's nervous about what the Trump administration is going to try to do to Chinese manufacturers. But that's a very, very robust website. So I encourage our listeners to check that out. And then I found another story, which is also a podcast out of Solar Builder. Okay. Chris Crowell does a regular show and called Power Forward. And he interviews a gentleman named David Dunlap from Baywa Re, the supply house, right? Baywa is a supplier. Their supply division is based in New Mexico, but they work nationally. And so this is kind of the yin and yang. I mentioned the energy show, and then you have this Power Forward interview, and they're quite different in their analyses. But they just asked this question: what is the outlook for solar in 2025? And they touch on some of these things that you and I have talked on. I think they're a little more optimistic in this one than they were on the energy show. And but I would encourage our listeners to check out the Power Forward podcast. It's on YouTube. I'm not sure if it's on audio platform. Oh yes, it is on Apple, Spotify, Podbean. Do you ever listen to Chris Crowell's show?
I do, yeah, and I actually listened to most of that interview with David Dunlap.
Cool. Yeah, I'd never seen David Dunlap speak. Very articulate guy. He's the VP of Product Strategy with Baywa. And Baywa is a German company, for those who don't know. And of course, the Germans have been grabbing onto the solar industry harder and faster than the US has, right? Even though we invented the stuff, Joe, we invented the modern PV crystalline cell in 1954 in New Jersey. But because we have cheap fossil fuels here, Europeans and Asians grabbed onto solar PV sooner and faster. And now they're thought leaders in that industry. We're still hardcore about technology and innovation, and we're a player. But, the 45 gigawatts or so that we might install or have installed in 2024 really pales in comparison to the, I think, 300 plus gigawatts that China's installing, right? Like China is a beast, and 70% of the global solar panels made on Earth are made in China. And that's true of batteries as well. And as you and I know, batteries and solar are like peanut butter and jelly.
Yeah, no, it was a really enlightening interview. I remember I talked to David at the NABCEP conference last year, and I was asking him when he thought that we were going to turn the corner on the slow growth and the sluggishness of the industry, and said, "Oh, a few more quarters, few more quarters." And I agree with him. And now I'm realizing that nobody knows. Nobody really knows the answer to that question. It just seems like a flat line for the foreseeable future, unfortunately, particularly on behind the meter. Um, but I agree, he's one of the most articulate, knowledgeable people in the industry. And whenever Chris interviews him, I listen because he really, I think, sees the trends from all the data that BayWa sees
Yeah.
when they're looking at their current sales and their forecasted sales. And they are one of the biggest distributors now, certainly in the country, if not the world, for solar and storage.
We have a comment from Casey Feasy. Thanks for or Feasel. Thanks for joining us, Casey. He says Elon endorsements of the new administration, regardless of how problematic that is, provide an additional layer of protection over the IRA and solar in general. And I do think Elon is a very interesting addition to the administration. I call it the Trump Musk administration, Joe. Um, and Elon is pro renewable energy, right? He is busy building technology like the Tesla solar roof, and of course the power wall and the mega pack. So, he's building solar batteries and EVs. And so he is all about the energy transition, and he sees it as a must do for society to become more sustainable. And I consider that transition, honestly, to be a national security thing also, because if you can get your power from the sun, which gives us 5 to 10,000 times more power than all of society uses. Okay, the sun has a lot of juice for society, but it's weird that Elon is also um, so pro fake news at the same time. Like that is I can't get behind that thing at all. But what do you think of Elon Musk being part of the administration?
Well, it's funny. Right before I got on here, I saw a cartoon. I think it was a New Yorker that had Elon's hand on the Bible with Trump's when during the inauguration, and they're both going to get inaugurated at the same time. I thought that was pretty funny. But it's a week ago, I learned that he's renting a cottage next to Trump's office at
Right.
Mar-a-Lago for $2,000 a night. And so I was doing the math, and I said, "What's $2,000 a night times 365 days times 4 years?" Yeah, he's probably going to make that investment and be there for the long haul. And as I was doing that math, I kind of had the same thinking that you did, which is like, well, this is probably actually a good thing for clean energy, having such an advocate there to make sure that electric vehicles and solar and all of the things that he's working on that he has a direct stake in are promoted and certainly not harmed. At the same time, there is this very frightening pro-authoritarian bent that he's now flying around the world trying to advocate for far-right parties all around the world. And so it's bittersweet and bizarre. Something you couldn't write into House of Cards. And I don't think anyone knows
Yeah.
exactly how that's going to go.
Yeah.
But my sense is that he was so instrumental to Trump's win, maybe in ways we'll never know,
For sure.
that he's going to be there for the long haul, and that for our industry, irrespective of what you think of all the other stuff, it probably is a net positive.
Yeah, I would agree. One of the things that both Trump and Musk want to do is reduce regulation on industry. Elon cares about this because of SpaceX. He wants less regulation so he can launch faster, crazier, big rockets, and for his mission for Mars. And then he wants to build factories, right, to build Teslas and batteries. And he wants that to be easier. And that's why he relocated to Texas, because it's just easier to permit and build stuff faster, right? California is too regulated, and he's fed up with California. He didn't completely pull out of California, but he's pretty down on it, right? But Joe, what other stories are in the news lately? We just have 6 minutes left. We're going to do a half-hour segment every month. We'll be back on February 7th, so you can look for that on LinkedIn or YouTube. We will pre-announce these lives on YouTube and LinkedIn. But Joe, what other stories should our listeners know about?
Well, I love the story you pointed me to this week about Jackery and all the innovation in roof integrated solar. I've been tracking that since the beginning because to me, that is really the holy grail. I cannot tell you how many people I met in my own solar installation business that they didn't want solar at all because of the aesthetics, or they didn't want solar on the front of their house, or their wife didn't like it on this side of the house, and that is a huge issue. And so if we can get to the point where roof integrated solar is easy to install, it's easy to sell, it's seamless, it's easy to decommission and to maintain, that really is a huge milestone for our industry and frankly for humanity. I mean, I've read China using solar for building their buildings. And now we've seen a lot of articles in the last year about vertical solar becoming affordable and solar fencing, solar modules being so cheap that it's cheaper to build a fence with solar panels than with fence materials. So that's, I think, a big trend we're going to see in the next few years is just creative uses for solar modules. And I'm most excited about roof integrated solar because if we get to the point where it looks the same and it's just powering your house, but it looks as good or better than a regular roof, and maybe it's the same cost, probably not going to be the same cost, but if it's close enough to the same cost where there's ROI there, then there really is no reason for anyone not to do it. And so I'm really tracking that closely, and I'm hopeful in the next couple of years we might get there.
Yeah, the building integrated PV, as we call it, is a wonderful segment. It's still a very small segment. Of course, you've got Tesla, you've got GAF, the largest roofing products manufacturer globally, now has a very robust solar shingle. And I had them on the show. I had Ray Holmes, who came from Tesla to GAF on episode 146. So check that out at cleanpowerhour.com. I think that's one of my favorite interviews from, I think it was 2023. And these these roofing manufacturers, it's a both ends. Some companies come from the solar side, some come from the roofing side, but this has happened periodically. They get in, they get out. But there's one clear trend is that it is happening and it will continue to happen. It's just a question of making it as cost effective as possible. The thing I like about the GAF product is it's a nailable shingle. Roofers are used to nailing these shingles to the roof, right, with a nail gun, boom, boom,
Hmm.
boom. And that's what the GAF product is. It's just like a shingle. Now, you still have to wire it up. You have to hire an electrician. So it is different, but it's not that different. And it's not completely aesthetically as pleasing either as the Tesla solar roof. The Tesla solar roof seems to be having a really hard time though, right? It's been a very slow uptake. I think they're on generation 5. It is getting easier and better, but the feedback I get from installers is really not very good. It's a very challenging product to work with. It's beautiful. And if I had $100,000 to roof my house, I would definitely install a Tesla solar roof. It's a premium product, but it's also complicated. And so there's room for more. Jackery, I knew Jackery because I was into RVing, and Jackery comes from the mobile power space. They make, portable batteries and then portable solar cells or solar modules for RVers and nomads. I was planning to become a digital nomad. I never launched because I couldn't figure out what to do with my poor cats, who are my best friends. Uh, and so and then I bought a Tesla, Joe, and
Uh-huh.
I had range anxiety. Um, so long story short, I am not a digital nomad. I'm planted here in sunny central Illinois with this lovely Parkland College 2 megawatt behind the meter solar array near my house. um, and but thank you for being here, Joe. I look forward to bringing this show to our listeners every month on what's the latest and greatest in the solar and battery storage industry. And we will, of course, be tracking the Trump-Musk administration. With that, I'm going to say to all our listeners and John Christensen and Casey Fiesel, thank you guys for being here. And we'll look forward to bringing you more news from Tim and Joe in the future.
Thanks, Tim. This was super fun, and I can't wait for the next one. We'll have a new two presidents the next time we talk.
That's right. And with that, I'll say, let's grow solar and storage. Take care, Joe.
See you, Tim.